Welcome to the New Haven Symphony Orchestra Composer Interviews. Today I'm talking to the renowned American composer Christopher Theofanidis. Welcome, Christopher.
Thanks, William. Great to be here.
At what age did you start composing and what was the impetus?
Well, I started at about the age of 18. I was pretty late, relatively speaking. I mean, what happened was I improvised a lot as a teenager on the piano and recorded those things and allowed a lot of imagination into work sessions and that kind of thing. But to actually put pencil to paper and make it work didn't happen until I was 18. And then I started, little by little, I started off as a piano major in my undergraduate program at the University of Houston. And then by the second year I had been asked to do a couple of short pieces for friends, and it made the transition quite naturally over the next couple of years.
Right. And what was the impetus for composing, for doodling at the piano?
You know, I always had a sense that I wanted to have a kind of poetic reaction to things that were around me, and oftentimes I gave myself kind of certain strictures in doing the improvisation. So I'd respond to something that I had seen recently in the news, that I had read in a book, a poem, and that kind of thing. They were kind of prescribed improvisations. And little by little I came to kind of appreciate kind of sculpting that material and those responses to things. And it's funny because actually now when I think back of my output, a lot of it has to do still with reactions to poetry, to literature, and that kind of thing.
Right. And do you still compose at the piano?
Yes, yeah, almost exclusively. Once in a blue moon I'll try my hand away from it just to see what comes out, because you never know. It's a different process that way, but mostly I spend a lot of time singing and working at the piano. And in fact, the first couple of weeks, usually of a new project, I'm improvising and trying to come up with material that I like to work with and seems to stick over some time.
And do you compose in short score?
Generally, yes, though short score may not be just 2 staves, it may be actually 4 or 5, depending on the scale of the piece. But I try to do a score that will allow me to get the big shape of the piece first. Some pieces, like I'm working on a piece right now for string quartet and piano, require kind of the full score.
Yes.
But a lot of times for the larger ensemble pieces, I start with short.
So for an orchestral piece, do you hear the instruments and write the names of the instruments in whilst you're doing it in short score?
You know, it's a little bit like you're not quite sure if you're dreaming in color or black and white. The line kind of blurs a little bit. Sometimes I sketch out notes to myself where I hear things quite clearly as colored textures, and other times it's more melodically driven or harmonically driven and with a very vague sense of how the instrumentation will happen. And I find that spending time after that in the kind of orchestration phase where you're really filling out the detail, then you have maximum flexibility. And in fact, you can add layers and things to what's already there. It doesn't necessarily have to be note by note what's on the page.
So after the short score, then the orchestration,
Right.
And that is the laborious, the hard work.
Well, no, actually, strangely, you would think that was the case, but for me it's the other way around. The hard part is making the timing of the shape work out just so. I mean, it's very, I think of it as almost balletic, that you have to have exactly things in the right place for it to feel quite organic. And the orchestration is like eating cheesecake all day. It's just a blast. I mean, it's all, you know, coming up with all kinds of coloristic possibilities and seeing how harmonies will stretch with different colors and registers, and kind of rethinking things that are there. That's, for me, the most freeing and kind of liberating part of the process.
That's interesting, because I find I love the colours in your music and the transparency that you create. We recently performed Rainbow Body, and it's such a wonderfully transparent work. And I mused whilst studying the piece how you created those colours, and you just explained it.
Yeah, in fact, you know, it's a combination of playing with instrumentation, but also you know, thinking of the sonic concept of something from the standpoint of the organism of the ensemble. So, you know, orchestra is a large number of players contributing to one movement, and you can do things orchestrationally that help I won't say bulletproof, but help it along in terms of its agility.
Yeah.
Things that you wouldn't have to do in a small ensemble to give a certain kind of clarity of attack, of precision, so that when you have 30 players playing one attack, it really is clear versus something that's in a piano or string quartet that can be controlled quite easily.
The great German abbess, philosopher, writer, composer, Hildegard von Bingen has been a big influence in your compositional life. What is it about her?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that apart from having a general concept from which her life was formed, and then music came out of that aspect of her being, made a big impact on me. But also, when I think about her music, I think that music is so beautiful and was so beautiful 900 years ago, and music hasn't really improved since that time, but has kind of changed forms and directions and shapes. And I try to always remember that I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. I'm trying to find ways of expressing things which have a kind of staying power, and that usually for me comes from the humanistic side of things, emotive and memory-driven things, melody and feeling of harmony and that kind of thing.
There is a purity about her music, though, that is spiritual. Is that something that attracts you to her compositions?
Very much. Her music, first of all, was written for women, not for men. So the quality of Gregorian chant, which has a kind of earthy kind of quality to it, a spiritual quality, but it has a deeper sense, is very light and has a very different sensibility about it because it was written for higher voices. It has a more agile quality, I would say. The intervals and things are much more easy to jump around, and they don't have quite the same kind of groundedness that Gregorian music has. And the sense of space, the sense of that, she was writing for music in an abbey or a monastery originally, and that this music would need time to breathe in its space. So phrases kind of linger in the air before the next one starts and that kind of thing. And that, I think, gives a sense of spirituality in a way, a sense of kind of reflective space in the phrasing that you don't get in Mozart, for example, in quite the same way. It's very different.
It's like the big opening unison theme that's in Rainbow Body.
Exactly.
But one of the questions I wanted to ask you was the cello solo, this massive leap. What inspired? Where did that come from?
Yes, I've heard a lot of, I either heard a lot or received a lot of angry stares from cellists around different orchestras because of that. My own sensibility, strangely, even though I'm in great admiration of hers, is much more romantically kind of driven. And I sometimes like the contrast of something which is more static and more in a state of repose against something which is more intense. It's kind of a counterpoint for me. And so that piece is full of those kinds of things. And that particular one I think is quite notable because it's at the beginning of the piece in an otherwise kind of motionless texture. So it really stands out. But I also like bold strokes and things, I could have done that with the violin, put it up there or done something and it wouldn't have been quite the same level of intensity, but I like the idea of this kind of rumbly cello having suddenly a vaulting line.
It's the whole range of the instrument, virtually.
Yeah, that's right.
And it does make an incredible statement at the beginning of the piece. One of your most recent successes was the opera that you wrote for San Francisco.
Right.
Tell us a bit about how that came about and how difficult it was to put it together.
Well, that's opera is the last place I think a composer can go in some ways, and from a solo piano piece where you're totally in control of what you're doing to an opera where there are so many cooks in the kitchen that what you end up doing is collaborative and hopefully in the best sense where everybody is really coming together and giving the best they can give, and something even better is created out of everybody's efforts. This piece was particularly meaningful. It was having to do with September 11th primarily. The arc of it starts in Vietnam and actually in Cornwall in World War II, and ends up in September 11th. And it's a true story about a Briton-American soldier who kind of bond for life over their many soldiering experiences together, and end up after wartime trying to find a purpose in life for what their particular talents are. Soldiering often doesn't have translatable kind of skill set in civilian culture, and they both end up playing quite a crucial role in September 11th. So the story was very moving, it was true, and 3 of the 4 original protagonists were people that I got to meet. The 4th one died, and the British guy died in one of the World Trade Center towers. And so translating that into a real story was quite an ambitious thing, and topical in the sense that obviously we were on the 10th anniversary of 9/11.
Yeah.
I was in New York, about a mile north of the Trade Center when it fell, and had very, very clear vision of the week following that and memories of that period. So it meant something to me personally to actually kind of work on the project, as the librettist was in the same situation. And it was a big, long arc from 5 years' time of trying to plan this out and get the story just right, and adapt a full lifetime of experiences into basically what turns out to be a 2.5-hour time period. But very meaningful and full of a lot of urgency and kind of life themes of honoring the deepest potential that you have and what you're called to do, you can't turn away from.
All right. Is it going to be performed on the East Coast?
I hope so. I can't say yet, but I'm hopeful. There are 2 places that look quite promising, and I haven't heard a confirmation yet, but we'll see what happens.
We look forward to hearing about those.
Thanks very much.
The orchestra has embraced quite a bit of your music over the last few seasons, and is going to in the next few seasons. It's fascinating for us as performers to get to know contemporary composers and to introduce composers to the audience. The response of our audience has been overwhelmingly positive. Do you know who you're writing for?
At the end of the day, it's just me in the room. And it's got to make sense to me as the primary audience, first audience member, in a way, listening to this. Some people have kind of a crass sense that, when people write things that are accessible, that they're writing for a mass public or whatever. And I don't think that's the case. People ultimately write for themselves first, and if it doesn't make sense to them, they can't hope that it will make sense to a larger group of people. Partly I think that what's happened since that piece Rainbow Body is that because the orchestra can sound good playing it quite quickly, and it's got a kind of narrative arc, yeah, and that kind of thing, I think it has had a little bit more appeal on a bigger level, which has been great for me. I mean, a number of opportunities have come up out of that initial kind of success of the piece.
It's not a glib question, and I didn't wish to make it sound so, but I think that many composers live in these kind of ivory towers, which a composer needs to be alone and with their own creativity. But at the same time, once you've given birth to a piece, it has to have life in the community, in concert halls, wherever it's being performed. And we've seen, certainly in my professional life, so many composers that have just disappeared because they don't know who they're writing for. And I certainly think that Schubert, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, they did know who they were writing for. Yeah. And whilst they pushed the boundaries at the same time, there were definite traditions and accepted practices that they had to adhere to, right, which in the latter part of the 20th century seem to have been thrown out of the window.
Right. I think people, turned inward and kind of too inward in some ways. I mean, there's a kind of a thing that Socrates apparently referred to as, the direction that, in his case, a philosopher was pointing, so that if they were pointing exclusively inward, they were speaking to about 1% of the people. He said the middle ground is the important part, the 5%, where you achieve highest standards, but you also have that. And then not to forget that there are 94% of the people who are still there. And people are, artists, philosophers are all oriented in different ways, naturally speaking. I mean, they can't help it. It's just their personality, the degree to which somebody is a social person or, for whatever personal reasons is a hermit and kind of can't communicate well on a public level. I think it's going to come out in the music, and they have to honor that. And it actually takes all kinds. I mean, I would hate to have not had somebody like Milton Babbitt around, for example, or somebody who was more modernistic or esoteric in a sense, because I think that the bigger picture is great for that. And one always hopes that there's a little bit of balance in the opportunities, so that people who have different kinds of approaches can have those opportunities. And I'm a big believer in that.
Good. I think that's a perfect note to end this interview.
Okay, great.
Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Pleasure. Thank you.